Hi. We continue in Luke 4 today after Jesus has gone into the synagogue in his hometown of Nazareth and found the place in the scroll of the prophet Isaiah where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has sent me to bring good news to the poor." In other words, to proclaim Jubilee. And we see at the top of our screen there that after he'd finished speaking, in verse 22, all spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. But in a few verses, they're going to try to throw him over the brow of the cliff of the town and kill him. So what has gone on so quickly? What has Jesus said or done that has turned his hometown people so against him in a way that not even the devil in the previous scene threatened Jesus with direct violence or even appeared to be angry with him? He simply challenged him and then went away for another opportunity later, as we'll see. And Jesus is not faced with threats of violence very often in the gospel, and yet here in his first act in his hometown, he faces it. So the challenge of reading this has led many scholars to form very different views on this, and it's especially challenging for readers who aren't trained in how to do this kind of interpretation to make sense of this scene. So to kind of show my work a little bit, I've got on the right side of the screen a little chart that shows some of the tools that we use to interpret these texts that I've been using all along, but I highlighted them here so we can go over them briefly, and you can have a list of those if that's helpful to you posted on the website, and be aware of not only what I'm doing, but how you can do this yourself. So just to go over these 6 tools briefly, and there are other tools, but these are the 6 I'm going to be primarily using here. So narrative context, as you can see, has to do with how this story fits in with the world around it in the text. So immediately before this, of course, was Jesus in the wilderness with the devil. So what connections might we see there? And then this is setting up the rest of his ministry in Galilee, as we saw in the introductory video. So how is this setting up what will follow? Cultural context is anything we can know about the ancient world, or the world of the text, if not ancient in any context, that is different than our world, that helps us understand it. Today we're going to look at things like honor, shame, and patronage, and how those apply here. Intertextual echoing has to do with how this text in Luke echoes text other parts of the Bible, or it could be parts not of the Bible. In this case, it's going to be the books of Kings and Leviticus that are referred to either directly or indirectly, so we'll explore those. We need to study words because, as we know, this text was not written in the English you see on the left side of the screen, but in Koine Greek. And the New Revised Standard that I'm using here, because it's in my Bible program, is not always the same as other translations. So we need to not only look at translation, but we also need to look at how the particular Greek words are used either elsewhere in Luke or elsewhere in the Bible, or even more widely elsewhere in the Greco-Roman world, to understand some of the nuances of those words and what Luke might be bringing up here with that. Characterization is important. This is not just a collection of proverbs, it's a narrative, and it has characters in it who develop their personalities, at least what's revealed as their personality as the story goes. So what are we discovering about Jesus here and about the Nazarenes' perception of him? We see their first perception is this not Joseph's son, and they're going to not accept him as a prophet, as Jesus says in verse 24, as you can see. So what does it say about the Nazarenes and what they're hoping for, and what does it say about Jesus and what he says and how he responds? And how will that fit in with what we already know about him and what we'll see about him later? And then other literary elements like plot and suspense. We saw last time how the writer slows down the plot after Jesus reads from the passage and sits down, and it's a lot of detail that adds suspense to the story and makes us lean in and want to hear what happens. And so we'll see how literary aspects play out. So let's begin right away by jumping right in here. All spoke well is already a word issue, because the word there, martyrun, from martyrio, is the verb for witness or to testify. And it's 12 times in Luke Acts, but only here. It ought not surprise us that it's common Acts, because Acts is all about witnessing to Jesus. But here it's the only time and hidden behind the translation. So witnessing for or against Jesus here, scholars are divided on that, but many take it as a positive witness. But amazed can go either way here. Amazed can be positive or negative, and we see examples of that throughout. As we see in my note below, other amazements during Jesus' ministry express an element of doubt in those amazed. More negative word than thaumazo, which is also used, thanks to Raj Nadella's insight there. So amazed at the gracious words, or this is ambiguous here as green notes in my note. It could be words about God's grace, or winsome words, taking keratos as more metaphorical, or even words endued with the power of God's grace. In other words, is grace the subject, or is it a quality of the words? And that's ambiguous there. But some aspect of that is what leads them to be amazed, and the words that come from his mouth. But then they say, is this not Joseph's son? Now, we know he is Joseph's son, but recall from the genealogy, let's go back to that in 323, we remember that the narrator told us this. Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his work. He was the son, as was thought, of Joseph, son of Heli. So there's an ambiguity of that there, and they're raising it as a question. Is this not Joseph's son? There's no answer to that question here, though, but it's certainly going to the question of his credibility and why he can claim to be fulfilling this. It's also telling us something about them as characters, because they know Jesus. He's grown up there, and Luke, more than any other of the writers, talks about Jesus growing in wisdom and stature. So they've known him all his life, and perhaps that's exactly the problem. So then he goes on and says to them, doubtless you will quote me this proverb, and there are word issues with both of those. Pantos, the word for doubtless there, is only a Luke or Paul word. We'll see when we get to Acts that Luke and Paul share a lot of vocabulary. Paul's a major character in Acts, and one can certainly argue that they had some relationship, although it's never explicitly stated, and we don't know that directly, but there's a lot of vocabulary in common. As you can see, this word is only found here and in Acts and in the letters of Paul. So you'll quote me this proverb, or literally parable in here, 18 times in Luke, and all the others are for parables. Although it doesn't seem to be a parable, which is why the translators rendered it as proverb. It seems to be more of a proverb than a parable, but that's the word that's used there. The word here for doctor, iatros, doctor is terribly misleading because it would suggest to a modern audience something that we think of as an MD. But you can picture the white coat and the stethoscope perhaps, but this is a healer. And a healer can cover a range of things, everything from people who are trained in the Greco-Roman quasi-scientific method to local shaman and various types. But the proverb, curiously, is not a Jewish proverb, it's a Gentile proverb. Well-known maxim antiquity, as Green notes there. And the point of it is, and it's worth reading his quote, it's employed in argument to insist that one must not refuse to do one's own relations the favors one does to others, or that one must not benefit others while refusing the same benefits to one's own relations. It is clear then that the following sentence is only an interpretation of the first aphorism. In other words, what he's setting up here is something that we're going to explore around the term patronage. And patronage and honor shame are two aspects of the cultural context here that we're going to look at. Many books have been written on it. You probably can't do any better here than David De Silva's recent book in the early 2000s on honor, shame, and patronage, setting it up for ordinary readers like I assume anybody watching this video is. There are more scholarly books on these things, but this is a nice introduction, and I'll name elements of that here. Specifically, what's at issue here is the honor of a given community in contrast with other communities. Honor and shame play out individually and communally. And in the Roman world, there was an incredible competition among cities, and we'll see that play out a number of times here. It played out in public ways, like in the games, the Olympic Games, but other kinds of games where cities competed with each other. But it also played out in what scholars call the patronage system. Patronage has to do with what you see whenever you go to a cultural event like a symphony or a theater, and you see on the wall or in the program the circle of big donors, and the bigger the donor, the bigger the circle, or the bigger their name is, which is, say, patrons of the arts, those who exchange money or resources for status, for getting their name in lights or in gold or in bigger letters. And in our culture, that can be in small ways like that, just the honor of having your name on there. But it can also make you an important person that people go to. For example, if you offer grants and people want to honor you, praise you in order to get your favor. In the Roman world, it was more systematic than that. The Roman world operated under the patronage of the gods, that by honoring the gods, that the gods would provide good things for the people, and then underneath that, the patronage of the emperor, and then underneath that, the various levels of society. And in any local place like Nazareth, or in any of the cities of the Roman Empire that are more specifically Roman, like, say, Ephesus and Corinth that Paul goes to in Acts of the Apostles, we see that kind of competition played out. For example, Ephesus competed over the issue of being twice Neokoros, a word that gave them honor of the temple of Artemis. And we see that in Acts 19, where they say, great is Artemis of Ephesus, when Paul challenges their role there. So we see that Luke will play out that issue of hometown patronage and honor in various places. And that's what we're seeing here. And we see more clues of that cultural context as the story unfolds. So he says, do here also in your hometown. And this is a key word here, patridi, for fatherland. It can be hometown, but it literally means the land of your father, anything having to do with your father. And that brings up a really important link, because it's used again here in verse 24 that I want to bring up, to the Jubilee. And I've not really noticed other scholars bringing this up, so I will claim this as my own element of this. I provided the Leviticus 25:10 here in the Greek, and I know that you probably can't read that, but here's the word at issue, patridi in Greek, matching the same word here. And I note that it's in the Septuagint of Leviticus, where the Hebrew has mishpacha, or clan. So every one of you, when there's a Jubilee, go back to your own family or clan. But the Greek, which is what Luke was reading, we don't know that he could read Hebrew at all, has patridi, go back to your fatherland or your homeland. In other words, we've already seen Jesus proclaim just in the previous scene that Jubilee is his mission, and in the Jubilee, everybody goes back to their fatherland where debts are released and everybody has the same status. Unlike what the folks in Nazareth do, he implies, by saying this, you will say, do here in your patridi the things that we have heard that you did at Capernaum. In other words, this rivalry between Capernaum and Nazareth as two local towns around the Sea of Galilee. They've heard it, and we saw earlier that the narrator told us that Jesus went about the cities of Galilee, and then he came to his hometown. So the rumors had spread before he got there that he'd done great things at Capernaum. They're probably excited that Jesus, the hometown hero, is going to put Nazareth on the map, give them greater honor, and perhaps even attract some patronage to them in relation to Capernaum. So that's what Jesus is unmasking here, that they're seeing him as someone who can do something for them. And he follows it with another statement, a little proverbial statement, and also two intertextual references that are key to the story here. So again, Marshall notes that this one as well is not understood as being having Jewish context, but is also one familiar with the Hellenistic world, that a prophet is not accepted in the prophet's patridi. And the fact that he's bringing up prophet not only sets up the Elijah and Elisha stories, but it recalls a characterization question about Jesus, that Jesus is a prophet, and he'll tell stories about two prophets, Elijah and Elisha, that follow here. So here he goes to that. Let me move this down so we can see much of the rest of this scene and connect with our stories. So let's look at these three verses together, and then we'll go back intertextually. So the truth is here, Letheia, for truth, he used only surprisingly 3 times in Luke. There were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, and the widow brings up intratextually, which is, say, within Luke, both the reference to Anna earlier, and then we'll see to the widow of Nain in chapter 7, who's also intertextually echoed in the story of the widow of Zarephath, as in the second half of the story, that beyond what we're going to look at, that's echoed in this scene. So Luke makes double use of that echo. So many widows in Israel at the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land, yet Elijah was sent to none of them except to a widow at Zarephath and Sidon. And here's this story, and we'll come back to it in just a second. And then he continues, there were also many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, the apprentice to Elijah who followed up with him, after him, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian, and that's what leads to their outraged reaction there. So let's look at these two stories, and as we do, let's pause for a moment to note the male-female pairs here. We've already seen that with Elizabeth and Zechariah in the first chapter, and also with Joseph and Mary and Simeon and Anna, and now we have it further in the story, and we'll see more others, including paired with the widow of Nain there. So let's go back to our passage here. So if you're not familiar with the story, I won't read them all here to you, but it's helpful, I hope, to have this next to it so we can see that not only is this an example of what Jesus is saying here, which was sufficient in itself, that the history has that prophets were sent not to their hometown or to Israel, but to others. But when we look at the story, there's more to it than that, because in both these stories, the widow and Naaman at first refused to accept what the prophet is offering. So here it's about food. He calls to her, "Bring me a little water in a vessel so I may drink, and bring me a little bread." And she said, "As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing. I'm going to prepare it for myself and my son that we may eat it and then die." But he says, "Don't be afraid," and promises that the God of Israel will provide, and sure enough, that's what happens. Then we look at the longer passage, and it's a longer passage, and I've highlighted a few elements because we're not going to read the whole thing. But it really is important that we see some of the key connections here. So Naaman is the commander of the army of the king of Aram, and he's a leper, as we're told. And so he understands from somebody else who's been in the land of Israel that there's a prophet in Samaria, which is in Israel as opposed to in Judah, who can cure him. So he writes to the king of Israel, and the king says, "I'm not in God's place. What can I do for you?" So then Elisha hears of it, and when they finally get together, he tells him this: "Go wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." But Naaman became angry, and then argues, "Much like the people of Nazareth are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them?" In other words, why should I go wash in a foreign river? He's willing to go to the foreign prophet, but he wants to wash in his own rivers. And he went away in a rage, in the Septuagint, thumos, using exactly the same term as the Nazarenes here. That's certainly not a coincidence. The word is not used that many times. And the fact that Luke has the synagogue people respond exactly the same way that Naaman responds at first certainly can't be a coincidence. They're both enraged at the idea that they have to consort with foreigners. There's a xenophobia element, and there's also the competitive honor-shame patronage element, but in this case, both. A little different than competing with Capernaum, which would be not xenophobic in that case, as it is here, going after the foreigner. Jesus is not proposing the story, after all, that Gentiles would be healed or foreigners would be healed, but simply that he went to Capernaum first and isn't necessarily going to do the same things in his hometown. The story is really not about foreigners at all. The Luke story, it's the king stories that are about foreigners. But Naaman doesn't end there. He continues on here, and he eventually goes and washes in the Jordan and is cleansed. And then he knows that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel, and wants to pay Elijah for it, and Elijah refuses. In other words, he will not be a mercenary prophet, nor will be a patron. He will not accept this. He's doing it simply because God has told him to. Much like Abraham refuses to get paid by the king in Genesis 14 for winning the war. But surprisingly, Elisha's servant goes back and extracts money from him, and Elisha challenges him on it. And when he does, he says the leprosy of Naaman shall now cling to you, because he accepted money for doing something that should have been done as a gift from God. So the intertextual passages really help us to hear what's going on here. The rage we see here is because the people refuse to engage in Jesus' ministry of Jubilee. They refuse to be seen on the same level, an image that will come out much later in chapter 6, where Jesus, unlike in Matthew, where he goes to the top of a mountain to preach, will go to a level place, and that leveling is a big Jubilee theme throughout, both in terms of financially, but also in the visual metaphor of that, of like the valleys being filled in and the mountains being torn down, and all those things, the level place. So the social leveling and the physical leveling are parallel here, and that's what Jesus is about, is a leveling that gives everybody the opportunity to have what God wants them to provide. And the Nazarenes are having none of it, and they got up and drove him out of the town, which led him to the brow of the hill which their town was built, and they were going to hurl him over the cliff, but he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. It's not the time for him to die yet. But this little scene shows us that Jesus' ministry is not going to be received well among his own people, here in the Nazarenes, but more widely the people of Israel. And so in Acts of the Apostles, that will lead to a message that is extended both to Israel, starting with Jerusalem, but to the ends of the earth. Because after all, that's the God of the Bible's view all along, starting in Genesis 1, that all human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. Jesus doesn't go to Genesis for this passage because these other passages are more fitting because of their more specific verbal and cultural context here. But he could have gone there, and we'll see how Peter goes indirectly to that place when he has his own insight in Acts that God shows no partiality. So that'll be a key element of this message. Can the people of Israel accept the fact that in Jesus' view, they're no longer chosen to be different than everybody else, but we're simply an example to invite others to share in the benefits of being the people of God, because all people and all creatures are elements of our children and offspring of the one Creator God. So we'll continue with Luke 4 and see what happens after he escapes their midst next time. See you then. Bye-bye.